The security alarm shrieked through the Ashworth mansion as Cordelia Ravencrest froze in front of the Monet water lily painting, her hand still gripping the authentication device that had triggered the motion sensors. She had 3 minutes before the security company called the police, maybe less if the owner was home. Step away from the painting. The voice came from behind her, low and commanding. Cordelia turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. A tall man stood in the doorway of the private gallery, his dark hair disheveled as if he'd been sleeping. His gray eyes swept over her with the kind of calculating assessment that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "I'm Cordelia Ravencrest," she said, raising her hands to show she wasn't holding anything dangerous. "Your father hired me to authenticate the collection. My father is in Geneva." The man stepped closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something she couldn't identify. And he never mentioned hiring anyone. Cordelia reached slowly for the contract in her jacket pocket, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Hadrian Ashworth's assistant called me yesterday. Emergency authentication for insurance purposes. The Monet needed verification before the policy renewal." The alarm continued its relentless wailing. The man studied the contract she handed him, his eyes flicking between the document and her face. She noticed his hands were steady despite the chaos of the alarm, and there was something unsettling about the way he seemed to be memorizing every detail of her appearance. "You drove here from Boston in the middle of a nor'easter to look at paintings?" He handed back the contract without taking his eyes off her. "I drove here because your family is paying me $50,000 for a week's work." Cordelia kept her voice level. "The storm hit after I arrived." The man walked to a panel hidden behind a sculpture and entered a code. The alarm died instantly, leaving them in a silence that felt more threatening than the noise. "I'm Lysander Ashworth. This is my house. Your house needs better communication between family members." Cordelia tucked the contract back into her jacket. "I've been here since 4 o'clock. Your housekeeper let me in and showed me to the guest quarters." Lysander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Helena doesn't work weekends." The lie hung between them like a challenge. Cordelia had arrived to find the mansion empty except for an elderly woman who'd claimed to be the housekeeper. The woman had given her keys, shown her to a room, and disappeared before Cordelia could ask any questions. She'd spent the evening eating takeout in the kitchen and reviewing the collection catalog. "Then who let me in?" Cordelia asked. Instead of answering, Lysander moved to a different painting, a small Degas ballerina that looked wrong even from a distance. "What's your assessment of this piece?" Cordelia approached carefully, pulling out her magnifying loupe. "Without proper testing, I'd say it's a skilled forgery. The brushstrokes are close, but the aging on the canvas is artificial. Someone treated it with coffee grounds and baked it to simulate age damage." "How long would it take you to determine that with certainty?" 3 days with the right equipment." She lowered the loupe. "Why?" Lysander was already moving toward the door. "Because you're leaving in the morning. I have a contract. Contracts can be broken." He paused at the threshold. "My father made a mistake hiring you." The dismissal hit her like a physical blow. Cordelia had driven through a dangerous storm, left her sick mother with a neighbor, and canceled 3 other jobs for this opportunity. The Ashworth Commission would cover her mother's medical bills for 6 months. "You can't just fire me without cause." "I don't need cause. This is private property." Lysander's voice carried a finality that made her stomach drop. "There's a guest room on the 2nd floor. The blue bedroom at the end of the hall. You can stay until the road's clear, then you leave." "Wait." Cordelia stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Let me prove I'm worth the money. Give me 1 piece to authenticate. If I'm wrong, I'll leave without payment. If I'm right, honor the contract." Lysander turned back to face her, and something flickered in his expression. 1 piece. That Degas is fake, but there's something more interesting about it. Cordelia moved closer to the painting. Someone didn't just forge it. They replaced an original. The frame is authentic 18th century, and there are trace marks where a different canvas was mounted. Someone swapped out a real Degas for this copy. "Prove it." Cordelia examined the frame more closely, running her fingers along the edges until she found what she was looking for. There. She pressed a hidden mechanism, and a small compartment opened behind the frame. Inside was a rolled piece of canvas. Lysander was beside her instantly, his shoulder brushing hers as he peered into the compartment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, like static electricity, but warmer. She carefully extracted the canvas and unrolled it on the nearby table. The original Degas was exquisite, the colors still vibrant after more than a century. But what made Cordelia's breath catch was the small inscription in the corner. For my darling Helena, until we meet again. E.D. Edgar Degas gave this to someone named Helena. Cordelia looked up at Lysander. The same name as your supposed housekeeper. Lysander's face had gone pale. That's impossible. Why? Because Helena Ashworth died in 1924. Lysander was on the phone before dawn, his voice sharp and demanding as he spoke to someone who clearly didn't appreciate being woken at 5 in the morning. I need a complete background check on Cordelia Ravencrest. Everything. Medical records, financial history, family tree going back 3 generations. He paced the length of his study, unable to sit still since finding the Degas inscription. Yes, I know it's illegal. Do it anyway. Cordelia had spent the night in the blue bedroom, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. He'd heard her moving around, probably researching the Helena connection on her laptop. The discovery had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Helena Ashworth was the first woman in his family line to die from the genetic condition, the patient zero of their curse. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. The private investigator worked fast when properly motivated by money. The blood work results made his stomach drop. Type AB negative with the specific protein markers that acted like a beacon for his family's genetic abnormality. Cordelia Ravencrest was a walking death sentence, and she had no idea. Lysander found her in the kitchen, sitting at the marble island with coffee and toast, her laptop open to genealogy websites. She looked up when he entered, and he forced himself not to notice how the morning light brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes. "Good morning to you too," she said when he didn't speak. "I've been researching Helena Ashworth. She married into your family in 1923, died less than a year later. Official cause of death was influenza, but the timing seems convenient. You need to leave." Lysander kept his distance, staying on the opposite side of the kitchen island. "Today," Cordelia closed her laptop. "Because I found something you didn't want me to find. Because you're not safe here." "From what?" "A 100-year-old family mystery." She stood up, moving closer. "I looked into your family's medical history last night. There's a pattern of women dying young after marrying Ashworth men. Always within the first year of marriage. Always from sudden illness." Lysander backed toward the door. "Stop. Your great-grandmother, your grandmother, your Aunt Catherine who married your uncle." Cordelia's voice gained momentum. "All dead within months of joining the family. What are the statistical odds of that happening naturally? You don't understand what you're dealing with. Then explain it to me." She stepped around the island, closing the distance between them. "I'm not leaving until I know why you're trying to get rid of me." The sound of heels clicking on marble echoed through the foyer, followed by a voice that made Lysander's jaw clench. "Darling, you really should lock your doors. Anyone could just walk in." Celestine Whitmore appeared in the kitchen doorway like a vision from a fashion magazine, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Her pale blue eyes swept over Cordelia with the kind of dismissive assessment that could wither flowers. "Celestine." Lysander's voice was flat. "What are you doing here? Daddy's helicopter was in the area. I thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing." Celestine glided into the kitchen, her designer heels clicking against the floor. "I see you have company. This is Cordelia Ravencrest. She's authenticating some artwork." Lysander positioned himself between the two women. "She was just leaving." "How fascinating." Celestine's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I'm Celestine Whitmore. Lysander and I have been friends since childhood, among other things." Cordelia's eyes flicked between them, reading the subtext immediately. "Other things. We were engaged until recently," Celestine said with practiced casualness. "But Lysander has such peculiar ideas about relationships. He seems to think love is dangerous." "Celestine." Lysander's warning came out rougher than intended. "What?" "It's true." Celestine moved to the coffee maker, making herself at home. "He broke off our engagement because he's convinced he's cursed. Something about his family being toxic to women. Quite literally, he claims." Cordelia went very still. "Toxic how?" "Oh, it's all very dramatic," Celestine continued, oblivious to or ignoring Lysander's growing tension. "He believes he carries some genetic condition that makes him dangerous to be around. As if anyone could believe something so ridiculous in this day and age. Enough. Lysander's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. Celestine, you need to leave. Now. I'm just having coffee with your new friend. Celestine's eyes glittered with malice. Unless there's some reason you don't want us to talk. Cordelia was staring at Lysander now, pieces clicking into place behind her intelligent eyes. The medical records. The pattern of deaths. You think you're killing them. He doesn't think it, Celestine laughed. He's absolutely convinced. It's why he pushes away every woman who gets close to him. Such a waste, really. All that money and good looks, and he's too paranoid to enjoy either. Lysander felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the helpless fury that came with watching someone he cared about walk toward their own destruction. Celestine, if you don't leave right now, I'll have security escort you out. You can't scare me away, Lysander. Celestine set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. I know you too well, and Miss Ravencrest deserves to know what she's getting involved with. What am I getting involved with? Cordelia's voice was steady, but Lysander could see the pulse jumping at her throat. Before he could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his private investigator's number. Sir, you need to see this immediately. I'm sending over the full genealogy report on Cordelia Ravencrest. The man's voice was urgent. Her father was Dr. Marcus Ravencrest, the same Dr. Ravencrest who worked with your grandfather 30 years ago on Project Genesis. The phone slipped from Lysander's hand, clattering against the marble floor. Cordelia was staring at him with growing alarm, and Celestine was watching the entire scene with predatory satisfaction. Project Genesis? Cordelia whispered. What was Project Genesis? 3 days later, Cordelia stood in the mansion's grand ballroom watching caterers arrange champagne flutes on silver trays. She'd convinced Lysander to let her stay by promising to organize the annual Ashworth Foundation Charity Gala in exchange for answers about Project Genesis and her father. He'd agreed with obvious reluctance, then disappeared for 2 days, leaving her to work with Orion Sterling, the butler who seemed to know more family secrets than he was willing to share. The ballroom buzzed with preparation. Paintings lined the walls, each one tagged for the auction that would raise money for genetic research funding. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same family that claimed to carry a genetic curse was hosting an event to cure genetic diseases. The Picasso should be moved closer to the entrance. Celestine's voice cut through the activity. She swept into the ballroom wearing a red cocktail dress that probably cost more than Cordelia's car. First impressions matter at these events. The placement is fine, Cordelia replied without looking up from her clipboard. The flow directs guests naturally toward the higher value pieces. How would you know? This is your first Ashworth Gala. Celestine moved to examine the Picasso, her movements deliberate and possessive. I've been attending these events since I was 16. Cordelia finally looked at her. But you've never organized one. The barb hit its mark. Celestine's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Lysander always handled the details himself. He has very specific ideas about how things should be done. Had, Cordelia corrected. Past tense. He hired me to handle it this year. Before Celestine could respond, Lysander appeared in the doorway. He'd been avoiding Cordelia since the phone call about her father, but tonight he wore a black tuxedo that transformed him from brooding recluse to devastating socialite. Their eyes met across the room, and the familiar jolt of electricity made her forget about Celestine entirely. The guests are arriving, he said, moving toward them. Are we ready? More than ready, Cordelia replied, proud of the transformation she'd accomplished. The auction should bring in twice what you raised last year. Lysander's gaze swept over the room, taking in details she hadn't even noticed he'd observe. You moved the Monet. Better lighting. The evening sun hits it perfectly from that angle. She watched his face for approval. I thought you'd prefer to showcase the authentic pieces rather than hide them. Something shifted in his expression. You hung it exactly where my great-grandmother had it in 1924. The comment hung between them, loaded with implications. Before Cordelia could ask what he meant, the first guests began filtering into the ballroom. Within an hour, the space was filled with Boston's elite, all eager to bid on valuable artwork while congratulating themselves on their charitable giving. Cordelia found herself standing near the Degas they'd discovered, watching guests examine the piece without knowing its true history. A small placard identified it as recently authenticated, but gave no details about the hidden original or the mysterious Helena inscription. You clean up well. Lysander appeared beside her, holding 2 glasses of champagne. Though I suspect you'd rather be in your lab coat with a magnifying glass. You suspect correctly. She accepted the champagne, hyper-aware of how close he was standing. But I have to admit, seeing people appreciate these pieces makes the formal wear bearable, even when half of them are buying status symbols rather than art. Especially then. Art should be seen, not hidden away in private collections. She gestured toward an elderly man examining a Van Gogh sketch. That gentleman has been staring at the same piece for 20 minutes. He understands what he's looking at. Lysander followed her gaze. Thomas Whitmore, Celestine's father. He's probably calculating how much his own collection is worth based on tonight's prices. You're cynical. I'm realistic. He moved closer, ostensibly to point out another guest, but the movement brought his shoulder against hers. Art authentication taught you to see past surfaces. This crowd has taught me the same skill. The contact sent warmth through her entire body, and she forced herself to focus on their conversation rather than the way his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. Is that why you avoid these events? Too much surface, not enough substance. I avoid them because crowds make me nervous. His voice dropped lower, meant only for her. Too many variables to control. Before she could ask what he meant, Celestine appeared with a photographer in tow. Lysander, darling, we need photos for the society pages. Celestine positioned herself between them with practiced ease. The foundation's donors love seeing familiar faces. The photographer began snapping pictures, and Celestine posed with the kind of effortless grace that came from years of practice. She drew Lysander into frame, her hand settling on his arm with casual ownership. Miss Ravencrest, would you mind stepping aside? The photographer asked. We need a clear shot of Mr. Ashworth and Miss Whitmore. Cordelia started to move, but Lysander's hand caught her wrist. Actually, I'd prefer photos with the woman who organized tonight's success. The photographer looked confused, but began adjusting his angle. Celestine's smile became razor-sharp. Of course, she said sweetly. Though I should mention, Lysander, Daddy was asking about Miss Ravencrest's qualifications. Apparently her father had quite a reputation in certain circles. The room seemed to grow quieter around them. Lysander's grip on Cordelia's wrist tightened slightly. What kind of reputation? Cordelia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Celestine's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. The kind that gets you banned from every major research institution in the country. Tell me, dear, did you know your father was considered a madman before he died? Cordelia's hands were shaking as she locked herself in the mansion's library, Celestine's words echoing in her head. Madman. Banned from research institutions. The gala continued without her, but she could hear laughter and conversation filtering through the heavy oak doors. She pulled out her laptop and began searching for information about her father's research career. What she found made her stomach clench. Dr. Marcus Ravencrest had been a brilliant geneticist until 1995, when he'd been dismissed from Harvard Medical School for conducting unauthorized human experiments. The official reports were vague, but the implications were clear. Her father had crossed ethical lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The library door opened without a knock. Lysander entered, loosening his bow tie as he approached her table. The gala raised $200,000, he said, settling into the chair across from her. You should be celebrating. My father experimented on people. Cordelia didn't look up from her laptop screen. According to this, he was trying to create genetic modifications in living subjects. The university buried the research to avoid scandal. Lysander was quiet for a long moment. What else did you find? He worked with someone named Dr. Harrison Ashworth from 1993 to 1995. Your grandfather, I assume. She finally met his eyes. What was Project Genesis, Lysander? A mistake that's been killing my family for 30 years. Cordelia closed her laptop. Tell me, your father and my grandfather thought they could enhance human genetics. Make people stronger, more resistant to disease, longer lived. Lysander's voice carried the weight of old grief. They succeeded, but not in the way they intended. What went wrong? The genetic modifications didn't just change the subjects. They created something like a biological weapon. Anyone with the enhanced genes became toxic to specific blood types and protein markers. He leaned forward. My grandfather was one of the test subjects. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. And you inherited the modifications. Along with my father and uncle. We're walking biological hazards to anyone with the wrong genetic makeup. Lysander's eyes searched her face. Like you. Cordelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. How do you know I have the wrong makeup? Because I had you tested. The admission came out flat, matter of fact. Blood work, genetic screening, the full analysis. You have every marker that makes exposure to my family's condition fatal. She should have been angry about the violation of privacy, but all she felt was a strange sense of inevitability. That's why you've been trying to get rid of me. That's why you need to leave before you get sicker. Sicker? Cordelia stared at him. I feel fine. Even as she said it, she realized it wasn't entirely true. She'd been more tired than usual, had developed a low-grade headache that wouldn't go away, and her joints ached in a way that reminded her of fighting off the flu. She'd attributed it to stress and long hours working on the gala. The symptoms start small, Lysander said. Fatigue, mild fever, joint pain. Then they accelerate. As if summoned by their conversation, the library door opened again. A woman in her 50s entered, carrying a medical bag and wearing the kind of professional expression that meant bad news. Lysander called me. The woman said without preamble. I'm Dr. Evelina Cross. I need to examine you. I don't need a doctor. Cordelia stood up, suddenly feeling dizzy. I'm perfectly healthy. Dr. Cross approached with the steady determination of someone accustomed to uncooperative patients. How long have you been experiencing fatigue? I haven't, Cordelia stopped. There was no point in lying when the evidence was written on her face. A few days, maybe a week. Joint pain? Headaches? Low-grade fever. Each symptom Dr. Cross named was one Cordelia had been dismissing. This is ridiculous. I'm probably just tired from organizing the gala. Dr. Cross pulled a small device from her bag and pointed it at Cordelia's forehead. The thermometer beeped. 101.7 degrees. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Cordelia hadn't realized she was running a fever. I need to run some tests, Dr. Cross continued. Blood work, protein analysis, genetic markers. It won't take long. No. Cordelia backed away from both of them. I'm not letting you experiment on me like my father experimented on other people. This isn't experimentation, Lysander said, standing up. This is trying to save your life. By confirming that being near you is killing me? The words came out sharper than she intended. What exactly is the treatment plan, Lysander? Lock me in isolation until I die anyway. Dr. Cross looked between them with the expression of someone who'd had this conversation before. There might be options. Your father's research wasn't entirely destructive. Some of his later work focused on reversing genetic modifications. He was trying to undo what he'd done, Cordelia said. According to his notes, yes. But he died before completing the research. Dr. Cross opened her medical bag. The question is whether we can finish what he started. Lysander moved closer to Cordelia, stopping just out of reach. Let her run the tests. If there's even a chance of finding a treatment, we have to try. Cordelia studied his face. You're assuming I'm staying. You can't leave now. Not when you're already showing symptoms. His voice dropped. And not when I'm finally ready to tell you the truth about everything. The blood test results arrived at dawn, delivered by courier to Dr. Cross, who spread the papers across Lysander's dining room table like pieces of a fatal puzzle. Cordelia sat across from them, her fever having spiked to 102.3 degrees during the night, making her skin feel tight and hot despite the chills that made her hands shake. The protein degradation is accelerating faster than I expected, Dr. Cross said, pointing to columns of numbers that meant nothing to Cordelia but made Lysander's face go pale. We're looking at weeks, not months. Weeks until what? Cordelia asked, though she suspected she didn't want the answer. Until the cellular damage becomes irreversible, Dr. Cross replied with clinical honesty. Your immune system is attacking itself in response to exposure to Lysander's modified genetics. It's like an extreme allergic reaction, but instead of anaphylaxis, your body is slowly destroying its own organs. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Cordelia had spent her life studying art, analyzing brushstrokes and canvas aging, but she'd never considered how quickly a human body could deteriorate. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could authenticate a painting's age within decades, but couldn't predict her own lifespan within years. There has to be something we can do, Lysander said. Some treatment, some way to slow the progression. Not without understanding exactly what genetic modifications were made 30 years ago, Dr. Cross replied. And those records were destroyed when Dr. Ravencrest was dismissed from Harvard. Not all of them. The voice came from the dining room entrance. Hadrian Ashworth stood in the doorway, still wearing his travel clothes from the flight back from Geneva. His gray hair was disheveled, and his usually impeccable appearance showed signs of a hastily arranged trip. He carried a leather briefcase that looked old enough to be an antique. "Father," Lysander stood up. "I thought you weren't returning until next week." "Dr. Cross called me." Hadrian's eyes moved to Cordelia, studying her with the same analytical intensity she'd seen in his son. "Miss Ravencrest, I owe you an explanation." Hadrian set the briefcase on the table and opened it with hands that shook slightly. Inside were files, photographs, and what looked like laboratory notebooks filled with handwritten notes. The papers had the yellowed appearance of documents that had been hidden away for decades. "Your father was brilliant," Hadrian said, addressing Cordelia directly. "Possibly the most gifted geneticist of his generation. But he was also reckless." "Reckless how?" Cordelia leaned forward despite her fatigue. "He believed that human genetics could be improved through targeted modifications. Not just correcting defects, but enhancing capabilities." Hadrian pulled out a photograph showing two men in laboratory coats standing in front of complex equipment. "This was taken in 1994. Your father and my father, Dr. Harrison Ashworth." Cordelia studied the photograph. Her father looked younger than she remembered him, his dark hair still thick and his eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that came from believing you were about to change the world. The other man, Lysander's grandfather, looked more cautious, as if he already suspected their research might lead somewhere dangerous. "What exactly were they trying to enhance?" Dr. Cross asked. "Everything," Hadrian replied. "Strength, endurance, disease resistance, longevity, even cognitive function. They called it Project Genesis because they believed they were creating a new type of human being." "Did it work?" Lysander's voice was tight. "In a way." Hadrian opened one of the laboratory notebooks, revealing pages of genetic sequences and experimental data. The modifications were successful in 17 of 20 test subjects. Enhanced muscle development, improved immune response, increased cellular regeneration. But there was an unexpected side effect. "They became toxic," Cordelia said. "Not immediately. The toxicity only manifested when the modified subjects came into prolonged contact with people carrying specific genetic markers." Hadrian looked directly at her. "Markers that your father had identified as key to the enhancement process." The implication hit Cordelia like a physical blow. "My father created people who were poisonous to people like me." "He created people who were poisonous to people with the exact genetic profile he was trying to enhance," Hadrian corrected. It was the cruelest irony imaginable. The people who could benefit most from the modifications were the same people who would die from exposure to them. Dr. Cross was studying the laboratory notes with growing fascination. "These genetic sequences are incredibly sophisticated. How did they isolate the specific markers?" "Trial and error," Hadrian said grimly. "Using volunteer subjects who believed they were participating in standard medical research. Your father convinced my father that the risk was minimal." "How many people died?" Cordelia's voice came out as a whisper. 7 during the initial testing phase. "All women, all with the genetic profile that your father had identified as optimal for enhancement." Hadrian's face was etched with old guilt. When the university discovered what was happening, they shut down the project immediately. "But the modifications had already been made," Lysander said. "My father, your grandfather, was one of the 17 successful subjects. He lived with the modifications for 40 years, but every woman he loved died within months of close contact." Hadrian closed the notebook. "Helena Ashworth, your great-grandmother, was the first casualty after the project ended." Cordelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with her fever. She had the painting, the Degas with her name on it. Edgar Degas gave that to her as a wedding gift. She died 3 months later. Hadrian's voice carried decades of family pain. "My grandfather spent the rest of his life trying to find a cure for what he'd become." "Did he find one?" Dr. Cross asked. "He died trying. But your father continued the research in secret after leaving Harvard." Hadrian pulled another file from the briefcase. "According to these notes, Dr. Ravencrest believed he'd found a way to reverse the genetic modifications. Lysander leaned forward. What kind of reversal? A targeted gene therapy that would essentially undo the original modifications. But it required extensive testing and refinement. Hadrian looked at Cordelia with something that might have been pity. Your father died in a car accident before he could complete the work. How convenient, Cordelia said bitterly. It wasn't an accident. Hadrian's words fell into the room like stones into still water. Your father was killed by someone who wanted to ensure the cure was never developed. The dining room went completely silent. Even Dr. Cross stopped rustling through papers to stare at Hadrian. Killed by who? Lysander's voice was dangerous. Someone who believed the genetic modifications were a gift rather than a curse. Someone who saw the enhanced capabilities as evolution rather than contamination. Hadrian met his son's eyes. Someone who wanted to ensure that future generations of our family would inherit the modifications rather than lose them. Who? Lysander repeated. Before Hadrian could answer, the sound of a helicopter landing on the mansion's grounds echoed through the windows. Within minutes, footsteps could be heard in the foyer, moving with purpose toward the dining room. Celestine appeared in the doorway, but she wasn't alone. Thomas Whitmore stood beside her, along with two men in expensive suits who looked like private security rather than household staff. I'm sorry to interrupt, Celestine said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But Daddy and I have some concerns about the direction this conversation is taking. Thomas Whitmore stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the documents spread across the table. Some family secrets should remain buried, Hadrian. Especially when digging them up puts innocent people at risk. Innocent people like your daughter? Hadrian's voice carried a challenge. My daughter understands the value of discretion, Thomas replied. Unlike some people who seem determined to resurrect dangerous research that should have died 30 years ago. Cordelia looked between the two older men, reading the subtext in their exchange. You knew about Project Genesis. Daddy was one of the funding sources, Celestine said with casual pride. The Whitmore Foundation has always supported cutting-edge genetic research. And you wanted to make sure the research stayed buried, Lysander said, understanding dawning in his voice. Thomas Whitmore's expression hardened. I wanted to make sure that dangerous experiments didn't continue to threaten innocent people. Dr. Ravencrest's death ensured that particular line of research ended permanently. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Cordelia felt the fever making her thoughts fuzzy, but she understood enough to realize that the man standing in front of her had ordered her father's murder. You killed him, she said. I prevented him from creating more monsters, Thomas replied without remorse. The genetic modifications should have died with the first generation. Instead, Dr. Ravencrest wanted to spread them further. He wanted to cure them, Dr. Cross protested. He wanted to perfect them, Thomas corrected. The cure was a lie. His real goal was to eliminate the toxicity so the modifications could be passed to a wider population. Cordelia tried to stand up, but the fever made her dizzy. Lysander was beside her immediately, his hand supporting her elbow, and she could feel his warmth even through the chills racking her body. Miss Ravencrest needs medical attention, one of Thomas's security men said. We should transport her to a proper facility. She's not going anywhere. Lysander's voice carried a finality that made the security men tense. Actually, Celestine said sweetly, she is. Like hell she is. Lysander stepped between Cordelia and Thomas's security men, his body coiled with the kind of tension that preceded violence. This is my house, and she's under my protection. Your protection is killing her, Celestine said, her voice carrying mock concern. Every minute she spends near you accelerates the cellular damage. Daddy's medical facility has equipment that could slow the progression. Equipment to study her, you mean? Dr. Cross moved to Cordelia's other side, her medical bag clutched like a weapon. The Whitmore Foundation isn't known for its humanitarian efforts. Thomas Whitmore's smile was cold as winter. Dr. Cross, your medical license could be reviewed if questions arose about your involvement in unauthorized genetic research. The threat hung in the air like a blade. Cordelia felt the fever making her thoughts sluggish, but she understood enough to realize she'd become a bargaining chip in a 30-year-old conflict. Nobody's taking her anywhere, Hadrian said from behind them. When Cordelia turned, she saw he'd moved to a wall panel and entered a security code. The sound of locks engaging echoed through the mansion. Orion, initiate lockdown protocol. Yes, sir. The butler's voice came through hidden speakers, calm as if locking down a mansion against armed intruders was part of his daily routine. Thomas's security men reached inside their jackets, but Lysander was already moving. The first man went down hard, his head connecting with the marble floor with a sound that made Cordelia's stomach lurch. The second managed to draw his weapon before Lysander's fist connected with his solar plexus, dropping him to his knees. Impressive, Thomas said, seemingly unbothered by his men's fate. But you can't keep her locked away forever. The cellular damage will progress whether she's here or in our facility. At least here she dies free, Lysander replied, checking the unconscious men for additional weapons. How romantic, Celestine's voice dripped with disdain. Love conquers all, even biological incompatibility. Cordelia tried to focus through the fever haze. The room seemed to be spinning slightly, and her joints ached as if someone had replaced her bones with broken glass. But through the physical discomfort, she felt something else, a strange electrical awareness whenever Lysander came near her. Not the painful toxicity she'd expected, but something that felt almost like recognition. There's something you're not telling us, she said, looking at Thomas. If you just wanted to stop the research, you could have destroyed my father's notes. Why kill him? Because he discovered something we couldn't allow to become public knowledge. Thomas's composure cracked slightly. The genetic modifications weren't random mutations. They were designed to create a specific type of enhancement. What kind of enhancement? Dr. Cross demanded. Telepathic sensitivity, Hadrian answered, his voice heavy with realization. That's why the toxicity only affects certain people. The modifications create a biological link between enhanced individuals and those with compatible genetics. The words hit Cordelia like a physical blow. You're saying the genetic modifications created telepaths. Not telepaths exactly, Thomas corrected, but individuals capable of forming deep biological bonds with genetically compatible partners. Bonds that enhance both parties' capabilities. Until one of them dies from toxic exposure, Lysander said grimly. Only if the bond isn't properly completed, Thomas replied. Your father's research suggested that the toxicity was a side effect of incomplete pairing, not an inevitable result. Cordelia felt something click into place, like tumblers falling in a lock. The women who died weren't genetically compatible. They were close enough to trigger the initial response, but not close enough to complete the bond. Precisely. Thomas's eyes glittered with something that might have been pride. Dr. Ravencrest believed he'd found the perfect genetic match for the enhanced bloodline. Someone whose genetics would complete the modification rather than be destroyed by it. Someone like me, Cordelia whispered. Someone exactly like you, Celestine said. Which is why Daddy couldn't let your father complete his research. A successful pairing would prove that the modifications were beneficial rather than harmful. Lysander was staring at Cordelia with an expression she couldn't read. That's why you've been feeling the electrical connection. Your genetics aren't just compatible with mine, they're complementary. Then why am I getting sicker? Cordelia asked. Dr. Cross was flipping through Hadrian's research notes with growing excitement. Because the pairing process requires physical contact to complete the genetic integration. Without it, your immune system treats the partial bond as an invasion. Physical contact, Lysander repeated slowly. You mean? Intimate contact, Dr. Cross clarified. The kind that would fully activate both sets of genetic modifications. The implication hung between them like a challenge. Cordelia felt her face flush, and not just from the fever. The idea of intimate contact with Lysander made her pulse race in ways that had nothing to do with her deteriorating health. Absolutely not, Thomas said firmly. The risk is too great. If the pairing fails, it could kill her within hours instead of weeks. And if we do nothing, she dies anyway, Lysander replied. Celestine laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. How perfect. The only way to save her life is to sleep with her. What a convenient solution to your genetic curse. This isn't about convenience. Lysander's voice carried a warning that made even Thomas's unconscious security men seem to stir nervously. This is about giving her a chance to survive. It's about completing an experiment that should have been terminated 30 years ago, Thomas countered. The genetic modifications were never meant to be inherited by future generations. Maybe not, Cordelia said, her voice stronger than she felt. But they exist now. and I'd rather die trying to control them than die as their victim. She stepped closer to Lysander, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. The electrical sensation intensified, like static electricity, but warmer, more alive. Her fever seemed to recede slightly in his presence, as if his proximity was stabilizing something fundamental in her cellular structure. "Are you sure?" Lysander asked, his voice rough with emotions she couldn't identify. Instead of answering with words, Cordelia reached up and touched his face. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, visible in the way his pupils dilated and her breathing quickened. But instead of the pain she'd expected, she felt a deep sense of rightness, as if puzzle pieces were clicking into place. "I'm sure," she whispered. "This is insane," Celestine protested. "You're gambling with her life based on 30-year-old research notes." "We're gambling with her life either way," Dr. Cross replied. "At least this option offers the possibility of success." Thomas made a sharp gesture to his recovered security men. "I won't allow this experiment to continue." But before anyone could move, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing the dining room in red shadows that made everyone look like participants in some hellish ritual. "Orion," Hadrian called out. "External power has been cut, sir." The butler's voice came through the speakers, calmer than ever. "But our backup generators will maintain essential systems indefinitely." "How long can you hold the lockdown?" Lysander asked. "As long as necessary, sir. Though I should mention that additional vehicles have arrived outside the perimeter." Thomas smiled in the red light. "I brought more than 2 security men, Mr. Ashworth. This mansion isn't as impregnable as you believe." "Then we'd better hurry," Cordelia said, taking Lysander's hand despite the shocked expressions around them. "Dr. Cross, what exactly do we need to do to complete this genetic pairing?" "I honestly don't know," Dr. Cross admitted. "The research notes suggest that the process is partially instinctive once initiated." "Instinctive," Lysander repeated. "Like animals who know how to mate without instruction." "Exactly like that." Dr. Cross began gathering the research files. "But I recommend we move to a more secure location. If Thomas's people breach the mansion, we don't want to be caught in a vulnerable position." "The master suite has its own security system," Hadrian suggested. "And medical monitoring equipment left over from when your grandfather was dying." Cordelia felt her face burn again, but she nodded. The fever was getting worse despite Lysander's proximity, and she could feel time running out like sand through an hourglass. "Lead the way," she said. As they moved toward the stairs, leaving Thomas and Celestine under guard with the unconscious security men, Cordelia tried not to think about what she was agreeing to. She was about to risk her life on an untested genetic theory with a man she'd known for less than a week, while armed intruders tried to break into the mansion. But when Lysander's hand tightened around hers, sending that electric warmth through her entire body, she knew she was making the right choice. Some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was certain death. The master suite occupied the entire 3rd floor of the mansion, its windows offering a panoramic view of the grounds where Thomas Whitmore's additional security forces had positioned themselves like pieces on a chessboard. Cordelia counted at least 8 men with military-grade equipment, their movements coordinated with the precision of a professional extraction team. "They're not here to negotiate," Lysander observed, pulling the heavy curtains closed. "Thomas wants to end this permanently." Dr. Cross was setting up monitoring equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Heart rate monitors, blood pressure cuffs, and several devices Cordelia didn't recognize filled a mobile cart that looked more suited to an intensive care unit than a bedroom. "Your temperature is spiking again," Dr. Cross announced, reading the digital thermometer. 104.3. "We need to move quickly." Cordelia felt the fever like a living thing inside her, burning through her veins and making her thoughts fragment. She sat on the edge of the massive bed, trying to focus through the haze of illness while armed men surrounded the mansion, and she prepared to risk everything on an untested genetic theory. "I need to tell you something before we do this," Lysander said, kneeling beside her. "The research notes mention that the pairing process can be intense, not just physically, but mentally. Our genetics might integrate in ways that go beyond what either of us is prepared for." "Meaning what exactly?" Cordelia's voice came out rougher than intended. "Meaning we might end up sharing more than just compatible DNA," Dr. Cross explained. The telepathic sensitivity that Hadrian mentioned could manifest as shared thoughts, emotions, even memories. The implications of that revelation made Cordelia's head spin, though she couldn't tell if it was the fever or the possibility of having Lysander's thoughts inside her mind. And if it doesn't work? Then you die within hours instead of days, Dr. Cross said with clinical honesty. But your cellular structure is already breaking down. This is our only option. The sound of glass breaking echoed from somewhere below them, followed by shouts and what might have been gunfire. Thomas's men were breaching the mansion's defenses faster than expected. Orion, status report. Hadrian's voice came through the intercom system. They've breached the east wing, sir. I've sealed the main stairwell, but they're working on the service elevator. The butler's voice remained maddeningly calm. You have perhaps 20 minutes before they reach the third floor. 20 minutes, Lysander repeated grimly. That's not much time for a genetic modification that's supposed to take hours. Actually, Dr. Cross said, studying the research notes, your father's calculations suggest the process accelerates under stress. Adrenaline and elevated heart rate seem to catalyze the genetic integration. How convenient that we're terrified and under attack. Cordelia managed to joke, though her attempt at humor fell flat in the tense atmosphere. More sounds of conflict filtered up from below, closer than before. Thomas's security team was moving through the mansion with methodical efficiency, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the master suite. There's something else. Orion's voice came through the speakers again. I've located Dr. Ravencrest's private laboratory. It's hidden behind the wine cellar, exactly where the building plans indicated it should be. Hadrian leaned forward. What did you find? Research equipment, genetic samples, and what appears to be a completed serum. Dr. Ravencrest's final work, ready for human testing. The revelation hit the room like a lightning strike. Cordelia stared at the intercom speaker, trying to process what she'd heard. My father finished the cure? More than that, Orion continued. He created a stabilizing agent that should allow the genetic pairing to complete safely. The serum is designed to prevent the cellular damage that killed previous test subjects. Can you retrieve it? Dr. Cross asked urgently. I'm afraid not. Thomas's men are between me and the laboratory. But Miss Ravencrest should know that her father left detailed instructions specifically for her. For me? Cordelia's voice cracked. How could he leave instructions for me? I was only 8 years old when he died. The instructions are dated 3 days before his death, Orion explained. He knew someone was trying to stop his research, and he suspected his own daughter might someday face the same genetic compatibility issues he was trying to solve. The weight of that revelation made Cordelia feel like she was drowning. Her father had known she might inherit his burden, had tried to prepare for a future where she'd need the very cure Thomas Whitmore had killed him to prevent. What do the instructions say? Lysander asked. That the genetic pairing must be initiated with complete trust and emotional connection, Orion replied. The telepathic bond requires not just physical compatibility, but psychological openness. Fear or doubt can cause the process to fail catastrophically. Complete trust, Cordelia repeated, looking at Lysander. With a man I've known for 6 days. With a man whose family your father helped create, Lysander corrected. Your genetics have been connected to mine since before either of us was born. The sound of an explosion shook the mansion, close enough to rattle the windows. Thomas's men were using more aggressive tactics to breach the upper floors. They're in the second-floor corridors, Orion reported. I estimate 12 minutes before they reach your position. Dr. Cross began attaching monitoring leads to Cordelia's arms and chest. We need to start now. Your temperature is approaching dangerous levels, and waiting any longer risks permanent brain damage. Cordelia looked around the room at the faces watching her with varying degrees of hope and desperation. Hadrian stood by the window, his expression haunted by decades of family guilt. Dr. Cross worked with clinical efficiency, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. And Lysander knelt beside her, his gray eyes filled with something that looked like love mixed with terror. If this kills me, Cordelia said, her voice barely above a whisper, promise me you'll destroy Thomas Whitmore. Don't let him cover up what happened to my father. It's not going to kill you, Lysander replied, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Promise me. I promise. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside grew louder. accompanied by voices coordinating an assault on the master suite. Thomas had brought enough firepower to level the entire mansion if necessary. "Dr. Cross," Cordelia said, lying back against the pillows. "Start the monitoring equipment." "Already running," Dr. Cross replied. Heart rate 130, blood pressure elevated but stable, temperatures still climbing. Lysander moved to sit beside her on the bed, his hand finding hers with the same electric awareness that had sparked between them from the beginning. But this time, instead of a pleasant tingle, the contact sent waves of sensation through her entire nervous system. "It's starting," she gasped, feeling something fundamental shift in her cellular structure. The bedroom door exploded inward just as Lysander's lips met hers, and Thomas Whitmore stepped through the smoke with murder in his eyes. Thomas Whitmore stepped through the smoke with a modified tranquilizer gun aimed directly at Cordelia's chest. Behind him, four armed men spread out across the room with military precision, their weapons trained on Lysander and Dr. Cross. "Step away from her," Thomas commanded. "The genetic pairing ends now." But it was already too late. The moment Lysander's lips had touched hers, something fundamental had shifted in Cordelia's cellular structure. The fever that had been burning through her veins suddenly transformed into something else entirely, a warm electrical current that seemed to flow between her and Lysander like a completed circuit. "I can feel your thoughts," she whispered against his mouth, her voice filled with wonder instead of fear. "And I can feel yours," Lysander replied, his hand tightening around hers. "The process has started. Thomas can't stop it now." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. "Watch me." The tranquilizer dart hit Cordelia in the shoulder, just as Orion's Sterling materialized behind Thomas like a shadow made solid. The butler's arm wrapped around Thomas's throat with the efficiency of someone who'd been trained for more than serving tea and managing household staff. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Orion said pleasantly as Thomas struggled against his grip. "Miss Ravencrest is currently undergoing a delicate biological process. Interrupting it now could kill both her and Mr. Ashworth." Dr. Cross was watching her monitoring equipment with growing excitement. "The genetic integration is accelerating. Cordelia's immune system has stopped attacking itself and started incorporating Lysander's genetic modifications." "That's impossible," one of Thomas's men said. "The research showed that integration takes hours under ideal conditions." "The research was incomplete," Hadrian replied from his position by the window. Dr. Ravencrest's final notes indicated that emotional bonding could catalyze the process exponentially. Cordelia could feel the tranquilizer trying to pull her under, but the genetic integration was fighting it, using the chemical intrusion as fuel for the transformation. Through her connection with Lysander, she could sense his strength flowing into her, stabilizing her system against the artificial sedation. "Amazing," Dr. Cross breathed, watching the readouts. "Her cellular regeneration has increased by 300%. The genetic modifications aren't just preventing toxicity, they're enhancing her natural healing abilities." Thomas finally broke free from Orion's grip, but instead of reaching for another weapon, he stared at Cordelia with something that looked like scientific fascination warring with deadly intent. "You're creating the next evolution of human genetics," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and horror. "Enhanced individuals who can bond with compatible partners and share capabilities. We're creating a cure for a condition you helped cause," Lysander corrected, though his attention remained focused on Cordelia. Through their growing connection, she could feel him monitoring her vital signs as closely as Dr. Cross's equipment. "A cure that turns two people into something more than human," Thomas replied. "Do you have any idea what governments would do to possess that kind of capability? What wars would be fought over the power to create superhuman soldiers?" "That's not what this is," Cordelia said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. The tranquilizer was losing its effectiveness as her enhanced metabolism processed the chemicals. "This is about love, not war." "Love doesn't exist in isolation," Thomas countered. "When word gets out about what you've become, every intelligence agency and military organization in the world will want to study you, replicate you, weaponize you. Then we make sure word doesn't get out," Orion said calmly. He'd moved to block the doorway, and Cordelia noticed he was holding what looked like a military-grade communications jamming device. "Thomas, your men outside have been experiencing technical difficulties for the past 20 minutes. Their communications equipment has failed, their vehicles won't start, and their extraction helicopter has developed engine problems. Thomas's eyes narrowed. What did you do? I ensured that tonight's events remain private family business, Orion replied, as I have done for the Ashworth family for 30 years. The revelation that Orion was far more than a butler wasn't surprising, but the implications of his capabilities were staggering. Cordelia felt Lysander's thoughts flowing through their connection, sharing his own surprise at discovering the depth of their household staff's training. The genetic integration is complete, Dr. Cross announced, her voice filled with scientific triumph. Cordelia's vital signs have stabilized, her temperature has returned to normal, and her immune system has fully adapted to incorporate Lysander's genetic modifications. Cordelia sat up, feeling stronger than she had in years. The constant fatigue that had plagued her since childhood was gone, replaced by an energy that seemed to hum through every cell in her body. More remarkably, she could sense Lysander's presence not just physically but mentally, as if they were two instruments that had finally been tuned to the same frequency. How do you feel? Lysander asked, though she suspected he already knew the answer through their connection. Like I can finally breathe, she replied. Like I've been living my entire life with only half my capabilities. And the telepathic bond? Dr. Cross asked with scientific curiosity. It's not telepathy exactly, Cordelia said, trying to find words for the sensation. It's more like emotional resonance. I can feel what he feels, sense his thoughts when they're directed at me, but I can't read his mind. Thank goodness for that, Lysander said with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Some thoughts are meant to remain private. Thomas made one last desperate attempt to reach for a weapon, but Orion's hand closed around his wrist with casual efficiency. I think it's time for you to leave, Thomas. Your experiment has failed. This isn't over, Thomas snarled. The world will find out what you've created here. Actually, it is over, Hadrian said, producing a thick legal document from his briefcase. The Whitmore Foundation's funding agreements include comprehensive non-disclosure clauses. Any attempt to reveal confidential research will result in immediate legal action and the seizure of all Foundation assets. You planned this, Thomas realized. We planned for the possibility that someone might try to interfere with our family's attempt to cure a condition that has plagued us for 30 years, Hadrian corrected. Dr. Ravencrest's death was never going to be the end of this story. Orion escorted Thomas and his men from the room with the polite efficiency of a butler removing unwanted dinner guests. Within minutes, the sound of vehicles departing could be heard from the grounds below. Is it really over? Cordelia asked, settling back against Lysander's chest and marveling at how perfectly they seemed to fit together. The immediate threat is over, Lysander replied. But we'll need to be careful about how we use these enhanced capabilities. Thomas was right about one thing: governments and military organizations would be very interested in what we've become. Then we live quietly, Cordelia said. We use our abilities to help people without drawing attention to ourselves. And we finish your father's work, Dr. Cross added. The genetic modifications could be the key to curing dozens of inherited diseases. Used responsibly, this research could save thousands of lives. Hadrian moved to the window and pulled back the curtains, revealing the peaceful grounds of the mansion under a sky that was beginning to lighten with dawn. The Ashworth Foundation will fund the research properly this time. No secret experiments, no unauthorized testing, no shortcuts that put innocent people at risk. Cordelia felt Lysander's arms tighten around her, and through their connection, she sensed his overwhelming relief that the curse that had haunted his family for generations was finally broken. More than that, she could feel his love for her, pure and strong and completely without reservation. I love you too, she whispered, answering the thought he hadn't spoken aloud. Even though I almost killed you, he asked. You saved me, she corrected. We saved each other. 6 months later, Cordelia stood in the same spot where she'd first encountered Lysander, but instead of authentication equipment, she held a wedding bouquet. The mansion's gallery had been transformed into a chapel, with paintings serving as witnesses to vows that bound not just two people, but two enhanced genetic lines that would carry their father's legacy forward into a future neither of them could have imagined. I pronounce you husband and wife, the minister said. You may kiss the bride. As Lysander's lips met hers, Cordelia felt the same electrical connection that had sparked between them from the beginning, but now it was amplified by love, by trust, and by the genetic bond that made them two parts of a perfect whole. Through their connection, she sensed his thoughts, gratitude for her presence in his life, wonder at the future they would build together, and absolute certainty that some risks were not just worth taking, but necessary for the kind of love that could overcome any obstacle. The Ashworth curse was finally broken, replaced by something infinitely more powerful, the promise that love, when supported by science and strengthened by sacrifice, could indeed conquer all.